Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm Adil Sultan. I'm the Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies. Today we have planned a wonderful joint event and discussion on a report with BASIC UK, which is doing wonderful work on nuclear responsibilities. Last year, uh, together, we were part of this project and we authored this report that is Emerging and Disruptive Technologies in South Asia, Perceptions of Risk and Responsibilities in Crisis Management and Prevention. And today we have the authors as well, the experts who would be discussing parts of this report, and then we will open it for discussion with our students and other participants of this webinar. So let me briefly tell you the Strategic Foresight for Asia is an independent platform, which is both located in London and now in Islamabad as well. And we are very glad that we are co-hosting this event with BASIC. So Mahari, if you could briefly talk about the BASIC work for the information of my students and other participants of this webinar, and then we will start with the experts discussion. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And on behalf of BASIC, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Strafasia, particularly Dr. Adil Sultan, your support in organising this event and for your support in organising this event, and BASIC is truly appreciative of the opportunity for being invited to speak with you today. We had planned to do this in person, and unfortunately we weren't able to do so last month. So we're very happy to be doing this with you virtually, and hopefully you have an opportunity to do something similar in person in the future. Before I hand over to my colleagues, let me just introduce you to our work. We have recently rebranded the Nuclear Responsibilities Programme as the Responsibilities and Global Governance Programme. We have decided to take this step because the number of issues facing global governance are increasing in number and becoming more complicated, as rising tensions between major powers and new emerging technologies such as AI reshape the international security environment. Nuclear issues are still a key part of our work, but today and tomorrow's risks are no longer limited to nuclear threats alone. Emerging domains such as cyber, space, and AI intersect with traditional nuclear risks, creating new governance challenges and responsibilities that the programme will seek to address. South Asia remains a key priority for our programme because of its unique escalation dynamics and complex interactions across multiple domains, including nuclear and emerging technologies such as cyber and outer space. The programme was set up in 2016 and we started this work of facilitation in 2022 when we first flagged the idea of shared nuclear responsibilities with Indian and Pakistani experts. It's very difficult for two states trapped in nuclear rivalries to think about shared responsibilities, and it is even more difficult after the May 2025 crisis. But at the same time, a focus on shared nuclear responsibilities can help move away from sterile conversations fueled by blame game, where one state considers itself irresponsible and blames the other for being irresponsible, onto more productive conversations focused on pathways to common security and risk reduction. Since 2022, we have facilitated several Track 2 India-Pakistan interactions, focusing in particular on the question whether responsible practices are in place or could be put in place to ensure that India-Pakistan crises do not happen, and that if they do, that they are de-escalated as swiftly as possible. India and Pakistan are of course not the only nuclear states that are exploring nuclear responsibilities. A broader responsibility turn is emerging in diplomacy in relation to what counts as responsible state conduct in relation to artificial intelligence, outer space, cybersecurity, and nuclear weapons. We at BASIC think that it is particularly important to continue to foster a conversation on nuclear responsibilities in the current nuclear order because the arms control architecture is eroding, and risks of misperceptions, miscalculation, and miscommunication are rising, also due to new challenges posed by emerging technologies. Binding legal frameworks such as arms control should remain our long-term goal, but there is no immediate prospect of new agreements. So for the near future, we should adopt a pragmatic and behaviour-based approach towards nuclear risk reduction by focusing on building new and agreed norms of behaviour based on restraint and responsibility. In South Asia, talking about nuclear responsibilities is particularly important because India-Pakistan nuclear dialogues at the Track 1 level have stalled, and there is uncertainty of Track 2 interactions after the May 2025 crisis. The India-Pakistan nuclear relationship is unique because of the operation of the stability-instability paradox. India and Pakistan possess nuclear weapons, yet there are still crises in conventional exchanges with high escalatory potential. At the same time, in the India-Pakistan dyad, as we argued in our 2024 report, There's been confidence that the other can be relied upon to show restraint in times of crisis, and that the crisis is unlikely to escalate to the nuclear level. This confidence, however, is proving fragile, and there is a risk that overconfidence may slip into complacency, especially in light of emerging and disruptive technologies and the most of the May 2025 crisis witnessed. For the first time in history between nuclear armed states, the use of missiles and drones targeted at key air bases inside each other's territories. Key questions therefore remain. How far can India and Pakistan go in climbing the escalation ladder in future crises without risking a nuclear war? And how far has luck prevented nuclear war in past crises? And how far can bilateral crisis management mechanisms do so? Is de-escalation a matter of luck, or is it a matter of shared restraint and responsible practices? And how can we ensure that responsible crisis management mechanisms will be in place during the next India-Pakistan crises, especially if EDTs are involved? These are some of the questions that we'll hopefully explore today in our discussion, and with that, I'll pass on to my colleague Evanor Repsor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mari, for the introduction, and I also like to echo the thanks of BASIC and mine to be presenting here today. This is really an honor to present our research, and we couldn't do it with all of you and the people that take part in our research. As I said, I'm just trying to look for the share button on my laptop, so that's why. Can you see it?
Yes, now. Yes.
Yes, amazing. Thank you. Just because it's just going to be loading for a second, and we start with that. So today, me and Nick have the honor of presenting our April 2025 report, Emerging and Disruptive Technologies in South Asia, Perceptions of Risk and Responsibility in Crisis Management and Prevention. So the work that started this work, it builds on BASIC's 2024 project and report Crisis Prevention and Management in South Asia, Mutual Confidence, Risk and Responsibility, written by Nick Wheeler, Chiara Savascio, and Mary McLafferty. That previous report focused on how perception and the current report focused on how perceptions of EDT are reshaping India-Pakistan crisis prevention and management. That report draws on a stream survey and two-track 2.145 dialogue, one in Manama in 2024 and one in Istanbul in 2025. And you can see just the link of the report below if you haven't read it. But I hope you have. So the report really tries to explore challenges affecting strategic stability, and it recognizes that technological innovation, such in AI, quantum, cyber, missile systems, is reshaping deterrence and crisis behavior. Precisely, the report tried to address how those technological asymmetries and partnership amplify distrust, and it aims to identify responsible practices and policy to reduce. Sorry, I'm just having to reduce. I'm having a bit of a trouble seeing my own slides, so I will just do that. To reduce risk in South Asia. Thank you for your patience. So the part A draws on a stream survey that was conducted by BASIC in the summer of 2024. And the part A seeks to look at the perception of EDT on crisis prevention and management. What were the main findings? The first finding is that there is a maturity gap in emerging and disruptive technology in India and Pakistan. As you can see, out of all the respondents, some of them were international respondents, that is, people not part of Pakistan or India. But as you can see, from all of the respondents, everyone seemed to agree that India is much more mature than Pakistan is with regards to almost all technologies. What I think is really important in those findings to note, for example, is that the maturity gap between AI for information warfare is much smaller than the maturity gap for BMDs, ASAT capabilities tools. And therefore, I think there's also a finding here that, what is tangible, it's easier to assess the maturity gap. Here I said that it was a mix of all participants, even including people not from South Asia. I'm telling you that because there is one technology that is not assessed exactly the same, and you'll see what I mean. So here what we can see is the impact on crisis prevention and the impact on crisis management. The red shows a negative impact, whereas the green shows a neutral to positive impact. So again, on all of those, we can see very much that for Indian respondents, Pakistani respondents, and non-South Asian respondents, most technologies are seen as having a negative impact. However, some technologies have seen as having a lesser negative technology impact. Here, for example, if we look at hypersonic cruise missiles, Indian respondent saw it as a 3.6, so close to a neutral impact, which is the score of 4, whereas Pakistani respondents saw it as a very, very negative impact, 2.3. And for crisis management, we kind of note the same, where it looks like Pakistani respondent overall saw the technology as having more negative impact than Indian respondents. But again, here to show that despite this, Indian respondents still pretty much show all the technologies as having a negative impact as well, but just not as much. So what are my analysis of the survey data? First, as I noted for AI information warfare, it's quite interesting because this is the only of the technologies assessed that does not fit the standard of Pakistani thinking that India is ahead and India thinking that India is ahead. In that information that was tested, we can see that Indian respondents saw that Pakistan was more mature than India in that technology. And I think this is really interesting because it can show two things, in my opinion. The first thing is that technology, AI for information warfare, which is mostly used to deceive adversary, does not have that much prestige. So it's not a technology that participants would want to assess as so mature in their country. However, I think on a positive note, it can also mean that this is the basis for cooperation. This is the sole technology where both Indians and Pakistani respondents think the other's ahead, which means that maybe that's a technology that can help us bring Pakistan and India to the table. The other finding that we saw is something that I call the maturity perception effect. And as you can see, there's almost a line that goes almost an X equal Y, I believe, or that should be it, through that, meaning that, when technologies are nascent, they often seem to inspire hopes for innovation and enhance deterrence. However, as this technology mature and the strategic application expand, respondents increasingly focus on the negative consequences, such as arms race, crisis instability, and the erosion of deterrence. Here, as we can see for AI for information warfare, it is the most mature it is perceived as the most mature in the region, and it is perceived as the most disruptive for crisis prevention and management. And when we look at quantum for C4ISR, this is the least mature in the region, but it's also seen as the most positive for crisis prevention and management. And finally, one of the final key findings is the strategic bias, as I mentioned a bit earlier, is that when comparing response from Indians and Pakistani participants, there is what it seems to be a proven perception gap where Indian, for almost all technologies assessed, perceive the technology as a bit more positive than the Pakistani respondent. And I think that can be explained because once you have the technology, you have the tendency to not see it as negative. Once you have the technology is more mature to your side, to you it's a positive technology. Whereas if the technology is less mature in your side, then you feel more a threat of this technology. So I think this is very important because this potential bias must be considered when interpreting all the data, as it highlights our national interests and access to technology can shed experts' opinion. So rather than a completely unbiased view of EDTs on crisis prevention and management, it seemed that respondents always viewed EDT's impact based on their maturity, the maturity gap, and the context. And with that, I think I'll pass it on to Nick to talk about unpacking EDT's perception, driver, and implication for crisis prevention and management in South Asia.
Thanks, Evanor. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Sultan for inviting us. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and to be able to talk about our report and related ideas. So after we've done the stream survey, what we wanted to do, that was obviously a quantitative methodological approach. So then what we were interested in doing, and obviously when you're designing research projects, you're always looking to triangulate data. So what we thought would be really interesting then is to apply a qualitative methodological approach. So we brought Indian and Pakistani participants together in a track 1.5, track 2 dialogue in Manama in November 2024 to explore perceptions of EDTs and to see how far that qualitative inquiry mapped onto the findings that Ebenor set out in the stream survey. And from the discussions in the dialogue in Manama, we identified 4 key perceptual factors that we think are at work here in understanding the impact of EDTs on India-Pakistan crisis management and crisis prevention. I'm going to briefly go through 2 of them are cognitive biases that you'll be familiar with if you know our work, and more broadly this literature within security dilemma theorizing in international relations. And then the other 2 kind of relate to material dimensions, I think you could say, although clearly there's a perceptual element to them as well. So let me briefly go through them. So the first one is this idea of what we call peaceful defensive self-images. The fundamental idea is in relation to EDTs is that each side believes that the other knows that the technology that they're acquiring, which they believe obviously is defensive, will be seen as defensive by the other side. So crucially, the fundamental problem is that this peaceful defensive self-image means that decision makers fail to understand that others may not see their actions as threatening. This is the classic problem of the security dilemma. We've got a quote there from Caspar Weinberger about America's strategic defense program in the 1980s. Weinberger, who was the defense secretary in the Reagan administration, said, the Soviets know perfectly well we will never launch a first strike on the Soviet Union. But of course, the Soviet Union did not have that assurance, and they interpreted America's developments of the Strategic Defense Initiative, a ballistic missile defense system, as extremely threatening to the Soviet Union's deterrent capability. So this peaceful defensive self-image essentially is the problem that we fail to see that others don't see us as we see ourselves. And it's compounded, next slide please, it's compounded when decision makers operate with what we call an inherent bad faith model. And this is the other side of a peaceful defensive self-image. It's the fundamental problem that we believe that we have everything to fear from them as against the peaceful defensive self-image where we believe that they have nothing to fear from us. And in relation to EDTs, the argument is we have to fear their technological developments fundamentally because we have this perception of them as having malign intent towards us. And what drives a bad faith model of an adversary is the belief that fundamentally the adversary's values and ideology make them an implacable threat to us. So you can see how if decision makers are operating with peaceful defensive self-images and bad faith models and interpreting EDTs through those 2 prisms, this is going to be a recipe for increasing insecurity, fear, and potentially escalation. And then next slide, please. All of this, those psychological dynamics, which we think are crucial to unpack and understand in thinking about EDTs, that arise out of deep distrust, indeed drive deep distrust. We believe there's a third problem that arises with EDTs, which is the problem that's known in the literature as offense-defense differentiation. This is the fundamental problem of how do you discern whether intentions are offensive or defensive from the technologies that people acquire when those technologies can have dual purposes. So cyber, BMDs, AI, all of these things can have defensive purposes, but they can also be part of offensive strategies. And it becomes extremely difficult to reassure the other side when they know that those technologies can be used either today or in the future for offensive purposes, even if you're professing your defensive intentions. So those 3 drivers of perceptions of EDTs belong to the India-Pakistan kind of bilateral relationship, if you want. But there's a fourth dimension that we identified from the dialogue in Manama, and that's the role of what we call strategic partnerships and technological asymmetries and technology transfers. And here, crucially, it's the concern on both sides that the strategic partners are providing capabilities and technologies that will give the adversary an upper edge, a competitive advantage that could be extremely troubling in crisis situations. And we obviously talk about the US relationship with India and then Pakistan's relationship with China. We can talk about more about that in Q&A, because obviously that strategic partnership dimension was an important feature of the May 2025 conflict. So I'm now going to hand over back to Evanor, who's going to talk about how we then brought people together to try in a further dialogue held in Istanbul in early 2025 to talk about then how you might overcome these perceptions and what kind of practices, responsible practices linking to our work on responsibilities and related policies might be developed to address these dynamics of EDTs that we'd identified in Part B. Evanor.
Thank you very much, Nick, for highlighting the driver. And as you mentioned, I'll just quickly go into the Part C, addressing emerging technologies, risks for crisis prevention and management in South Asia. Having identified how deep the distrust in the India-Pakistan relationship bring these key drivers into play, we invited in really an innovative and rare contribution to Indians and to Pakistani participants in our dialogue to identify the series of policy proposals that might reduce this distrust and establish new cooperative security policies in this space. So we decided to, participants and ourselves decided to separate the policies into three broad baskets: international, bilateral, between India and Pakistan, as well as track 2 1.5 proposition. Here, I'm just going to mostly talk about the bilateral responsibilities and policies, but I'll be more than happy in the Q&A to talk about the other policies that were highlighted by our participants regarding the international sphere. So on the bilateral front, as you can see, out of the policy raised, there was the improved channel of communication, integrating notably EDT discussion into existing hotlines and creating potentially new one in relation to cyber and AI threats that are increasing in the region. There was also the policy of a joint working group at track 2 1.5, tasked with reducing the risk that EDT pose to crisis management and prevention. A third policy was promoting new norm about responsible integration of AI into military postures, including unilateral or even bilateral commitment to keep human decision making in the loop for NC3 at least. And finally, one of the policies that was highlighted and supported was the extension of the 1988 non-agreement attack to, the non-agreement attack to prohibit cyber attacks against its side NC3 system and related space-based assets. And so after having gone through those policies, I'll pass it on finally to Nick for the concluding remark.
Thanks, Evanor. So just very briefly, just to offer some thoughts about kind of where we come out in the paper and kind of in the report, and kind of just to sort of flag up kind of how we might see the report in the light of what's happened since we wrote it, with crucially the May 2025 crisis, because obviously our report came out just before the conflict. I think what we raise in the report is the concern that strategic stability is increasingly under threat by an unwillingness on the part of, particularly, I think, we would highlight the Indian side here, but I think a concern that strategic stability is eroding because the principle of mutual vulnerability is not firmly in place on both sides. And that a principle and a commitment to mutual vulnerability is fundamental. And the concern about EDTs is that one or both sides might believe that in some way it could give them a winning advantage in a crisis situation. I think certainly my understanding is that the Pakistani perception very much after May 2025 is that the conflict shows that India, in the Pakistani perception, believes that it achieved escalation dominance, and that this is from our point of view, and the argument in the report, this is very worrying, because if one side believes that it had escalation dominance and that was decisive in a crisis, that could embolden it to believe that in a future crisis, it can achieve the same result by being prepared to escalate further. And the side that feels that it's vulnerable to that escalatory pressures and threats will want to do everything it can to restore deterrence by disabusing that state of the view that it does have that escalation dominance. And then the scene is set very clearly for a competition in the escalatory process, where one side is trying to secure domination over the other. So the worry that we raise here is that if there's growing confidence, particularly on the Indian side, that it has this escalation dominance and the EDTs will provide this, then that's extremely worrying, because it increases the likelihood that in a crisis situation, rather than finding an off-ramp, people will find themselves in increasing processes of escalation, which may be driven deliberately, but may also trigger inadvertent escalation if people fail to understand each other's thresholds, which is, I think, an increasingly important worry. Next slide, please. And then we also raise, I think, very importantly in the report, the real problem of reassurance. So even if there is a commitment on the part of India to reassure Pakistan that its technological edge in EDTs doesn't pose a threat to Pakistan, how does it reassure Pakistan in a context where India believes it needs those capabilities to deter China? So this opens up the problem that it's not just a bilateral game. This is a point which I think we have to be really thinking about is, it's not even a trilateral game, because obviously the wider India-China relationship is embedded then in the deeper set of relationships between the United States, China, and indeed Russia. So, what Rabia Akhtar calls the nuclear tetraplex rears its ugly head here in terms of how you go about doing reassurance in a multi-nuclear competitor environment. And I think we're only just beginning to grapple with that problem of how to manage reassurance and escalation management in a multiple nuclear competitor environment. And we give the example here of India's development of the 2,500 km hypersonic cruise missile, the Agni-5 being developed for conventional counterforce operations. All of these technologies, of course, risk blurring conventional nuclear thresholds and creating a fundamental problem of conventional nuclear entanglement. India's strike against the Nurkan base towards the end of the May 2025 conflict highlights that concern, I think, about conventional nuclear entanglement in a particularly important way. And then, so we raised this question about how might you do reassurance. We had discussions about this in the dialogue. There's the discussions about it in the report, but I think it's a major challenge. Next slide, please. And then finally, to sort of come back to the point I made about the importance of recognizing mutual vulnerability as the basis for shared security. Decision makers in nuclear armed states in relationships of deep distrust find it extremely uncomfortable to base their security on the restraint of the other side. But mutual vulnerability as a basis for strategic stability depends upon a willingness to accept that condition that your security is dependent upon the restraint of the other side. And how you entrench that perception and encourage people to feel comfortable with that vulnerability, I think, is a real challenge. And crucially, it's important to maintain confidence, though, in the other's restraint. Crucially, what Schelling called in 84 confidence in crisis. How do you build up confidence in the other's restraint? This, I think, is a critical challenge in an environment of deep distrust. And we argue in the report that it's very important to and look at how that can be strengthened, and our practices, responsible practices that are recommended through the work of Professor Sultan and the other three people that wrote that section from on both sides, which is such an important development to have that kind of work together, emphasizes, I think, the importance of trying to put in place practices and policies that reduce the likelihood of preemptive temptations in a nuclear crisis. And crucially, and this is an argument we develop at length in two new reports, one authored by Mary that's just come out, really excellent report on the May 2025 conflict based on the interviews that she and the team did, emphasizes the importance of reframing nuclear crises as opportunities for what we call cooperative de-escalation. This was first developed as a concept in the May 2025 report that we're talking about here, but we develop it at length in these two new reports as well as a key theme. And cooperative de-escalation is a way of thinking about a nuclear crisis in which both sides recognize that the fundamental enemy is the crisis itself and not the adversary. And it means rethinking and reframing nuclear crises away from this idea of a competition in risk-taking, Schelling's classic idea, towards this notion of cooperative de-escalation. And at the heart of that is the importance of communication. But communication per se, as we argue in our forthcoming new report based on the crisis simulations that we ran in Bahrain a few months ago, the importance of communication is that it has to be empathically motivated and grounded in this idea of security dilemma sensibility. And Schelling himself said that the best single example of confidence building was the Soviet-American hotline. And we've written and talked about the importance of developing stronger hotlines and communication channels in the India-Pakistan relationship in other work. And we can talk about that more in Q&A. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wheeler and Eva Mahari, for your remarks. Now I'll request my colleagues to share their perspective of this report. Faraz Heather is here. He's a faculty member as well as Senior Research Fellow at Strafasia. And then we have Dr. Anam Khan, who is Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Aerospace and Strategic Studies. So may I request Dr. Anam if you can take lead and offer your perspective on this report, maybe in 5, 7, 8 minutes?
5, 7, 8 minutes. All right.
So,
thank you very much.
So it's a complete spectrum of minutes, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, Dr. Wheeler and the team. It is a pleasure to be here. I did read the report quite earlier, and I had to reread it after so many months. So congratulations on what we have done here. There are certain things that I wanted to highlight, maybe not in that exact order, but overall, after I would be talking about a few aspects which could be further highlighted in this domain overall, because you see, if you talk about distrust, if you talk about offense defense, if you talk about the pernicious cognitive heuristics which was used in the report, I think cognitive bias is always going to be there in adversary relationships, unfortunately, as well as offense defense would always play a role when there is an asymmetry. In the longer run, we're not going to see this asymmetry settling down any soon. So what we have to do is we have to focus on issues where the vulnerabilities can be increased. But now the issue with emerging and disruptive technologies and risk reduction measures is you require transparency for confidence building measures and risk reduction measures in dialogue. But if you, for example, take AI into perspective, the transparency in AI or even in cyber domain may lead to further vulnerability of your adversary. So it would be very difficult to analyze and bring about commonalities where two state parties can sit and talk about risk reduction measures on AI. And if I particularly focus on AI, overall, we talk about human in the loop aspect only when we are talking about artificial intelligence or even the nexus of AI in NC3 systems. But the entire military life cycle of AI requires a strategic and systematic approach. It integrates safety, ethics, and security from design through deployment and then to retirement as well, because in all these levels AI has an impact on deterrence, conventional or nuclear, because we have talked about a lot about how AI can be integrated into nuclear command and control. Then if you talk about effective strategies involving defining specific mission requirements to ensure rigorous testing. For example, we have testing, evaluation, variation, validation, and maintaining human control, which was one of the elements discussed in the report, and the protecting data integrity aspect as well. So the requirements have to be looked at not just from a broader lens of AI and the human in the loop, but whole of the life cycle of AI. So what this would require would be a design phase, a development phase, testing and evaluation phase, and a bit of a transparency, which is very difficult to obtain. This requires a combination of technical safeguards, stringent operational protocols, and international confidence building measures. And we are seeing already what is happening on AI and the risk reduction measures related to AI globally. So another aspect that I also wanted to highlight and was intrigued about was the role of luck in deterrence. Missing link in deterrence is usually the role of luck, which is, in India-Pakistan context, I fear that we're not in the nuclear, illusion phase. We're mistaking luck for sometimes we're mistaking luck for a perfectly controlled system between India and Pakistan. So sometimes, even after May 2025 crises, we need to focus more on either is it a role of luck or is it exactly a proper perfect system in place. If you talk about what's happening regarding the words that were used, including the culture of restraint, the May 2025 crisis sort of, brought back a few aspects where you could see that the culture of restraint may erode. Why? Because of these EDTs. The more they are added to the nuclear nexus, the more they're added to the military domain, the more compressed decision-making time may be. And also, if you look at the emerging technologies, the danger would not be just the emerging technologies alone. It would be the way even report also at times highlighted about, for example, AI and ISR, AI in cyberspace, quantum in NC3, commercial satellites, open source intelligence, social media. So these are very tricky times where we have to roll back to maybe thinking about looking at nuclear deterrence from a different lens and not the typical Cold War lens. So the next report in this series, I hope that there would be one. It could argue about South Asia, entering into an integrated algorithmic deterrence, not just isolated technological competition where states acquire a certain set of capabilities regarding, emerging technologies. And also, another blind spot is that future crisis in South Asia is usually looked at through the state-centric approach. It could not be in the future initiated by states alone. So there could be other possible triggers like AI-generated false flag attacks, deep fake military orders, autonomous drone swarms by proxies, commercial satellite leaks, hacktivist escalation, and many more, including private non-state cyber firms. So the report does touch the information warfare. So we again also need to focus on decentralized escalation aspects of the things as well. Then, if you talk about policymakers, we cannot simply assume that they would have time, especially between India and Pakistan, and the way we saw the March BrahMos missile crisis in 2023. The policymakers would not have time to assess, verify, deliberate, communicate, de-escalate. So EDTs, as we already saw through the report as well and through the discussions, that they compress the time. The real issue is that the decision-making would collapse under algorithmic speed. This also deserves a deeper theorization. we could focus on compressed deterrence or maybe hypervelocity escalation. And then we could also focus on, cognitive deterrence or societal deterrence dynamics, especially after the increasing role of digital narratives through AI-generated media in recent India-Pakistan crises. And then there could also be a possibility, and BASIC and Strafasia could take the lead on the aspects of creating a South Asian, AI nuclear risk reduction, AI nuclear risk lexicon. South Asia lacks terminology in a way that India and Pakistan often define escalation differently. They define autonomy differently. Even they define cyber thresholds differently. So the recommendation would be to have a shared South Asian EDT glossary. Although I understand this sounds small, but it could become diplomatically important in the future. And then we should push for algorithmic restraint instead of traditional arms control measures, because arms control in the future may fail. Why am I saying it? Because I have recently written on our CBM regarding non-attack on nuclear facilities and how that could come under stress in the future war, considering how the strikes are becoming adamant where India is attacking Pakistan within Pakistan rather than just on the border. So behavioral norms may work, but possible proposals could be no autonomous nuclear launch pathways, which have in one way been addressed in the report. And then there should be some slowdown protocols during crises, because the more the EDTs are gathering speed, the more we are seeing that the crisis timeline is decreasing. So we have to overall establish a South Asian strategic technology risk index, if that could be done through BASIC and Strafasia initiative, where the next step could be tracking, AI militarization, cyber vulnerabilities, autonomous systems. This could be quite influential policy-wise as well. And I'm going to the end. After this, dialogue alone is a bit difficult to sustain the kind of idea that BASIC is trying to, the kind of aim that BASIC has. So I'm sure there must have been some simulation-based strategic engagement. This needs to continue as well. There's a need for escalation simulation lab in this domain, and we should, because you talked about the tetraplex aspect as well. I mean, I may personally not agree to the to the terminology of it, but let's be real that the major powers, what they do impacts the middle powers, and the kind of technological transfers, as mentioned in the report, are there. They create perceptions. So the future work could examine a lot more in detail about US-India tech transfer, or maybe China-Pakistan conventional military integration. Overall, South Asian deterrence is no longer regional. It is platform and globally networked as well. So how do we prevent escalation? So what kind of strategic stability, even for that, is even possible in the age of AI? So we need to focus on go back to the basics, definition of things, because these become really important when the crisis actually happens. Thank you.
Thank you. So you are advising BASIC to go to the basics. Thank you for these very useful ideas that you quoted. Actually, this report is about, and why I invited my arms control class into this. This is related to crisis management and prevention. So something that we will be discussing in our class. So this report is essentially about perceptions of risks and responsibilities in crisis management and prevention. So the perceptions of both India and Pakistan, since I was part of this project, and it was based on a wonderful survey methodology that EVA adopted. So it is based on the perceptions of Pakistani and Indian participants, how they view these technologies impacting on that. So all these issues we did discuss, the kind of deterrence relationship we have. But essentially, these were focusing on all the technologies in terms of near term, 5 to 10 years, for the technologies that these countries would require. And the other variable was how both countries perceive that the strategic partnerships are enabling their adversary in terms of capacity. So that's the perception. So whole idea is about the risk management and crisis prevention in terms of perceptions of both Indian sides. So that's that's why this report doesn't talk about the kind of deterrence. We had these deliberations during the physical sessions over there. So now I'll request Faraz, please go ahead, 5 to 7 or 8 or 9 minutes or whatever you want. So if you can keep it to 7 to 8 minutes, we will have some time for question answers.
Right, sir. I will keep it short because I'll focus on the second portion, the confidence building thing. And I mean, first of all, thank you, Strafasia and Dr. Adil and the basic team for joining us, and especially for writing this report, because on a personal level, it kind of became the basis for my research paper. This kind of foundational work, the survey and the maturity perception index, it was something very interesting and unique to see how that, that psychological domain, how important that is in this deterrence relationship. So I'm not going to get into the details of what that research paper covers, but I do want to bring up one thing before I go into, my take on how risk reduction can happen as from the opinion of a very starting off scholar. So I just want to share this picture, which is, I hope you can see. I think it should be visible. So this is from the research paper, and what it does is it's drawing on basics work for the most part, but I go into the whole topic and issue in a very specific way where I treat AI and quantum together, putting aside the other things, and the rationale for that is extensive, and I'm not going to get into that. But the CBMs that I'm going to sort of very briefly discuss stem from the same thing. So the logic for those CBMs or risk reduction mechanisms is that since the way that these technologies interact with the South Asian deterrence environment is one, pathway specific, and then two, it depends on the stage of the crisis. So whether it's the deterrence stage, whether it's the crisis is just about to happen, or within amidst the crisis. So my argument there is then that the risk reduction measures need to be pathway and stage specific as well. And so with that, I'll just get into those CPMs. Now, something that in the beginning, I think Ava talked about that how there's some level of overlap. Like one potential actual hopeful prospect in the findings was that both India and Pakistan see each other as being ahead in AI for information warfare. And we can use that as a basis to get something going. And the reason I found that interesting was because one of the suggestions that I had in mind actually dealt with that, where we create this sort of, and again, I'm assuming all of these negotiations are happening in the track 1.5, track 2 group that you guys have suggested. So I'm assuming that, these negotiations and things are happening over there. And so one of those CBMs is that where you create a AI and cyber incident communication protocol. So sort of not a hotline per se, but a communication mechanism, which includes technical experts, where the two countries can quickly inform each other about anything such as false alarms or any other misfires or any AI-related incident that happens. They can communicate with each other in reference to that. And the second thing is, again, connected to the AI for information warfare, is, I mean, if we think back on May 2025 and how the crisis was unfolding, it was, I personally felt that it was a information battlefield happening at the same time as the actual military kinetic engagement. So with that in mind, what we may need is some kind of regional fact-checking situation where a technical verification channel, such as alleged high stakes or manipulated synthetic content that was getting thrown around, airplanes attacking a strategic asset, getting into the Noor Khan air base, or vice versa, somewhere in Amritsar, and so on. So there needs to be some way, some formalized manner in which both countries can request each other for a technical verification, especially when when the alleged information going around in the digital space is about sort of a high stakes strategic level subject matter. And then the third thing, this would kind of deal with the transparency discussion that was going on, is that I don't think that general transparency or dialogues with each other would really work, because the lack of dialogue between the two countries to begin with. So if you're talking about risk reduction, there needs to be, because what it's affecting in the pathway is that both countries feel that their mutual vulnerabilities are getting exposed, and that equilibrium gets shifted. So in order to then make sure that these artificial intelligence enabled technologies and the integration in various military systems, and same for quantum in the longer term, so in order for them to not affect mutual vulnerability to an extent, should be a stage differentiated between deterrence, crisis onset, and within the crisis, a stage differentiated transparency and restraint mechanism, where during the deterrence period, peacetime, nothing is happening. We, both countries, bilaterally declare what kind of AI-enabled systems that we are not using, to provide a sort of negative assurance that, this thing we're not employing, this is not active on ground. So you can rest assured that this kind of system is not being used. And this isn't about sharing, strategic details about the operational capabilities. It is somewhat more. I don't want to use. It's kind of more political. It's more of a political signal that we're not going to use this. This is not active at the moment. And then the same sort of logic applying to the deterrence, the crisis onset stage, and then onwards into the intra-crisis escalation stage. So that kind of transparency about what we're not using, and also that we are using this, like that transparency of what systems have we integrated, what have we not, and that transparency does not have to be about everything. Something will purposefully be undeclared, but the fact of sharing some level of this system is being employed in C4 ISR, etc., then that would allow us sort of starting point, or somewhat improved risk reduction, from not going from deterrence to crisis onset, and from crisis onset to further escalation. So I'll keep it here, and I'm not going to go into the details further, because the rest of the details are more about the pathway and how the conflict escalates and why it doesn't. So that's a separate side and something that we can take up later.
Great, interesting ideas for us. Once you said the kind of a political engagement or understanding where both sides can give signal, maybe that certain technologies they may or may not use against the other side, I immediately correlated with the no first use commitment. So I think that's an interesting idea that you can correlate. So please feel free, if somebody has any question, please raise your hand and I'll call out. Yes, so we have Ms. Shazara, good to see you. She's from CAS. Please go ahead with your question, and then next would be Mr. Jan Nisar. Please.
Good evening, everyone. The Strafasia team, the BASIC team. My name is Shaza, and I'm a senior research associate at CAS Islamabad. Thank you for this wonderful event. My question is to the BASIC team. Anybody can answer from the team. That the report argues that emerging technologies are compressing decision-making timelines and increase risk of misperception. In parallel, if we go back to May 2025 episode, we see how the traditional mechanisms such as third-party mediation and restraint the traditional restraint, it enabled de-escalation. Now, in your assessment, do you think these traditional crisis management tools remain sufficient, or are technological changes beginning to outpace them? And just a follow-up to that, and at what point might these pressures make traditional restraint insufficient for crisis instability? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I think we can have another question, and then I'll request the basic team if they want to answer, or the Strafasia team. So, Mr. Janisar, please go ahead.
My name is Janisar, and I'm an ex-Air Force officer. And just to prove that everything is not what it seems, I will tell you that I was a cadet when Dr. Adil Sultan was my flight commander. So just to, Dr. Wheeler, thank you very much. I couldn't get the entire presentation. I read the report. And ma'am Eva, I think from Turkey, is it? Great to listen to your views also. I'm a PhD student, Sir Adil student actually. And I, like sir, I'm from Air Force, and time compression or things moving at a faster rate does not bother me a lot because being from air defense, I see things moving at greater than speed of sound. And it's only that when you have a mechanism in place which is enabled by AI, time actually elongates. And if you have a clear perception or clarity of picture of what's happening on ground and in air, sir will bear me out. When AI has a way of looking at threats, the threats which are at faster rate or speed, yet too far away, are taken first, and the closer threats are taken later. I mean, I'm sure that solutions to time compression can be found out. I just wanted to comment on this. I am optimistic that AI can help us with that. I was just thinking, I'm a student, I'm just learning the strategic studies. I think we are ahead of ourselves. I think that the present environment that we are in, where we continue to talk about Indian technological, I would say, being ahead of us in technology and their access to technology, we fail to register that the other side, which would be Pakistan in this case, would definitely feel the urge to match with that. So this emboldenment or emboldened Indian posturing is a result of what is happening at the global level. I think that Pakistan's access to technology remained a concern, but it has been proved otherwise around. So that, which means that other areas and other poles are catching up. I also think that, and I would just like comments on this, that this is, like someone pointed out, much different than Cold War. However, what's happening is that it might be another semi-bipolar world emerging, with China taking the lead. And already 2025 has shown that this technology that China offers has a lot to, it gives a certain amount of edge to Pakistan, which naturally fills up the gap that India perceived to have, as due to their, again, another perception that they have more access to technology. So this is also something that we have to understand, I think. And why I say we are ahead of ourselves is that we're talking about CBMs. We're talking about two countries which are adjacent, congruency of borders. They are nuclear powers. And one of them does not want to talk to the other one. So how can we even consider talking about CVMs? I say that we need to spend more time at the base. Let's continue to work on the foundation and look for an alternate view. And while somebody mentioned about third-party involvement, I think Dr. Anand talked about some very basic steps. But you see, all of them are one. It could be unilateral, which would not be fair on one side because both sides have a certain amount of parity in one domain. And the second is that even there is no global framework. In the absence of a global framework, we are in a process where things are being invented as we go along. REAIM is an example for all of you how US stance and Chinese position of not signing whatever you call it, the statement at the end of the conference, and Russia not participating, which means that let's not go ahead of ourselves. When the global powers or the bigger states cannot handle AI, its definition and cyber, let's not go there, and let's work at the basic foundational arrangement where we have to continue to assess why there is no contact between the two countries. And from there, it will start to, if at all, some way of talking specifically about AI and cyber, and however we should. I'm not saying that we should. So I would just like anyone from BASIC to respond to this. How is this situation different from Cold War? And looking at the history of how Cold War has gone ahead, is there a possibility?
Can we wind up, because we are running short on time?
What do you see as the possibilities that something fruitful might come up between India and Pakistan, especially in the context of EDTs? Thank you.
Okay. Well, great. So that's one perspective. AI may not impact, and we have to go down to the basics. I think the whole objective is that if even India and Pakistan are not ready to talk to each other, the emergence or evolution of these technologies may compel them that eventually they have to, in their own interest, not for the sake of each other. Anyway, I'll leave it to the experts to speak on this. So who is going to take a shot on this? Professor Wheeler, Eva, please go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much also to the participants and for all the questions. I just wanted to quickly raise in the next 2 to 4 minutes just about different points that have been touched upon, and then I'll leave it to my team. So far, I really wanted to thank you for all the different proposition that don't see him anymore. Oh yeah, the proposition that you raised with regard to the AI for information warfare and how it could be, a place for cooperation. I think most of what you raised is really interesting, and I haven't thought about it. And I know Mary will touch upon about how some participants in following dialogue did also talk a bit about that as well. But I did think lots of your propositions are actually really interesting, and I would like to read more about it if it's possible at any point, because I'm very interested in it. With regards to Anu, and you mentioned that, like looking into cyber and mostly looking at non-state actors for triggers to crisis with cyber and AI, obviously, because we know those technologies are more easily accessible for non-state actors. I think it's really interesting because out of all the interview we did in the summer 2025, so just after the crisis, and we really asked participants, whether do you think EDTs could trigger crisis? And at the moment, no participants out of 30 participants, so quite a lot of experts and, former officials, as far as I know, just told us that they don't see EDTs as being a trigger yet for future crises. So I think it is interesting. But if it's not a trigger, it's definitely something that can worsen the crisis. So it's definitely something that should be looked at more at length. And so with regards to AI, we'll just talk a bit about AI. I think, again, it's very interesting that you raised that, AI should be responsible by design. I think it's one of the key, regardless of where AI integrated, I think it should be done responsibly, such as with explainable AI. And so now, and also with training, but also again with AI, I think something that's very important is the specificity, the type of countries where it's going to be developed, and also the type of use is going to be used for is very different. If AI is just being used for a kind of ballistic missile system, I think usually those are low risk AI, and you might not even need that human in the loop necessarily. And I think even a human on the loop would be sufficient. But I think there's a big agreement that for anything related to nuclear, human in the loop is not even sufficient, and really AI should not touch nuclear whatsoever. And finally, just the last point from me on the time of, AI and compressing warfare. I think it's very interesting, but I think it's just very much dependent on the intentions of the militaries, right? So AI, for example, decision support tool can give you more targets, can give you an amount of targets, for example, thousands of targets in 1 second, compared to, military personnel that could give you targets in, 1 million. They could never give you 1 million of target in 10 seconds, no matter how much military personnel you have. But you don't need to you don't need to, strike every target you're being given to. So I think I think with regards to AI increasing the speed of warfare, it remains very much a choice from the military. AI is just something that's going to tell you opportunities for targets, but you don't have to strike all the opportunities. You just use it as a support tool, and then you yourself, the military, decide what they can do. So I think AI integration is very interesting. I think it's something that we will continue working on at BASIC, mostly with regards to crisis in India, Pakistan, because depending on how it is integrated, it can actually reduce the tempo of the crisis. It can actually allow decision makers to have more time to make the decision simply because of all the analysis that is given to them in seconds. But again, to me, it's a very specific, dependent on use case, depending on country, and depending on so forth. And I think I have a bit of all my notes here, so I'll just pass it on to either Nick or Mary, the first one that unmutes themselves.
I'll just jump in quickly. I just have a couple of short comments before I pass over to Nick. One thing is on Fraz's comments around AI for information warfare, particularly looking at the May 2025 crisis. We do have another report that came out just last month, so I can share the link to that in the chat, which is authored by myself, and it's looking at unpacking the escalation, de-escalation of the May 2025 crisis based on interviews that we ran last year. And as was mentioned, disinformation and misinformation did play a critical role as a potential accelerant of escalation during the crisis, particularly inadvertent escalation, with both governments accusing the other of waging information warfare. There was conflicting reports from all online sources, and both Pakistani and Indian interviewees noted that just the sheer volume of contradictory reports made it very difficult to distinguish between what is authentic and unreliable sources. And deepfakes were particularly prominent during the crisis, including fabricated videos, audio clips, different things like this. So in our forthcoming report, which will be out at the end of this month, we looked at, which is based off of some dialogues and crisis simulations we ran earlier this year. One of our policy recommendations coming out of those dialogues is fostering responsible communication with the public. So in order to combat nationalistic, moralistic jingoism, both India and Pakistan should promote responsible public communication through a number of different mechanisms. So this could be things like reinstating the 1950 Joint Press Code, encouraging responsible reporting that avoids sensationalism, as well as strengthening independent fact-checking mechanisms to counter misinformation and deepfakes. So that's just kind of some of the things that we've explored around that there. We've explored that in some of our earlier work as well, in our 2024 report also. And it's kind of all about kind of recognizing that, domestic messaging is often interpreted by the other side as evidence of hostile intent, thereby increasing the risks of misperceptions and escalation. And then just one very quick comment on the kind of points made around, any kind of potential benefits of the use of AI. I think ultimately, as it comes down to AI, as it is with all EDTs, it's not and we talk about this in the EDTs report as well, is that it's not the technology themselves that is considered as offensive mechanism. It's how you perceive your adversaries going to use them. So that comes down to kind of stuff that Dick talked about our peaceful defense of self-images, inherent bad faith models. So when actors are operating within these cognitive biases, is ultimately how they perceive that the adversary will act or use such technologies in a crisis situation. So I'll stop there and I'll hand over to Nick to make some more comments.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Before Professor Wheeler, you answer, Eva, can you answer the question that is in the chat box while Professor Wheeler can respond to the other questions? Yeah. Please, my apologies. Professor Wheeler, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So just picking up Mary's point about the new report, and it's great to see some people here on the call who were with us in Bahrain. One of the policy recommendations, Dr. Khan, that we make in the new report is for India and Pakistan to work together on developing a new lexicon. So responding exactly to your excellent point, that is a real kind of missing piece, if you want, in the nuclear risk reduction, crisis management, crisis prevention puzzle, is to try and get some kind of shared language. We talk in that new report as well about the importance of shared narratives and the importance of trying to think about developing shared narratives out of crises rather than divergent narratives. And Rabia Akhtar had a very nice piece on the BASIC website in July, making that very important point about the importance of thinking about trying to work towards a shared narrative. And one of the recommendations in the report we're talking about today, specifically the May 2025 report, is that there be a track 2 1.5 joint working group on EDTs. And I think that's the kind of vehicle where the kind of conversations you were talking about AI could take place. And in the 2024 report that Mary, myself, and Chiara led on, Dr. Cavasio led on, we argued for the setting up of what we called a South Asia Standing Communication Secretariat. And we argued in the report last year, the EDTs report, that this kind of working group on EDTs could nest within that larger structure. And in the new report, we suggest that that's the kind of forum where you could begin to talk about the origins, dynamics, and endings of particular India-Pakistan crises, using a kind of methodology of critical war history like was used during the Cold War in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis in particular, to try to think about whether it's possible to come out with a shared narrative. And the shared narrative that you'd be trying to explore is the possibility of seeing crises, as I was saying in my remarks, as moments of cooperative de-escalation. So rather than seeing it as a zero-sum game, be trying to think about it as a win-win situation. And I think, Shaza, that kind of comes back to your question about, are the crisis management tools sufficient? I was just searching in my notes for McNamara's classic 2 lines. So in 1962, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of State for Defense in the United States, said, there is no longer any such thing as strategy, only crisis management. But years later, when he was reflecting on the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to disaster, coming back, Dr. Khan, to your point about luck, because McNamara recognized that luck had played a really important role. He thought Kennedy and Khrushchev had been incredibly restrained, important, shown great statecraft, but nevertheless, if you study that crisis, you'll know there were moments where luck played a critical role in the determination of the outcome. So what he said, and I think this is really powerful, and perhaps this is the most important thing maybe to take away, certainly from my remarks here today. McNamara said years later, and this is quoted in Jim Blight's wonderful book, The Shattered Crystal Ball, from 1991, which is a great book. McNamara said, managing crises is the wrong term. You don't manage them because you can't manage them. And what he's saying there is that crisis management might not be fit for purpose in managing risks between nuclear armed adversaries. And that's why at BASIC, we've been very concerned to try to put crisis prevention at the kind of heart of a lot of what we do. But I think even more importantly than that in our work, what we're really putting at the center and what we're trying to emphasize more and more is the importance of thinking about crises in terms of this idea of cooperative de-escalation. So we're not talking about the escalate to de-escalate doctrine. We're not talking about unilateral impositions of will. We're talking about the idea that you work together and that the enemy is the crisis, not the adversary. And it's that shift which we're trying to think about through the policy recommendations, and I want to emphasize very much, the policy recommendations in the new report emerged out of the deliberations and the discussions at the dialogue in Bahrain after we'd done a day's crisis simulation. So we ran the crisis simulation, and then we had a session the second day that some people on the call played a very important role in, where we then talked about what came out of the crisis simulation for de-escalation. And we pulled out of that these policy recommendations and proposals that will be in the new report that will be published in a couple of weeks. So I think it's that focus on the idea that shared dangers can produce shared responsibilities and rethinking crisis management and reorientating away from that. I have a new paper with Phil Williams, who wrote a very important book on crisis management in the 1970s. It's coming out shortly, that tries to develop some of those themes a bit more in the wider context of thinking about the difference between the Cold War and the contemporary situation. And then just finally, circling back to the AI point, if I may, and make just very quickly 2 points. I really like the idea of trying to build in reassurance by persuading the adversary, for us, that you're not doing certain things and that you're refraining from this. But my immediate thought was, when you said that, was why would I believe that if I'm the adversary? How do you actually convince the adversary? It seems to me you need a real high level of trust in a channel there for people to really believe that. So that comes back to the importance, I think, of the interpersonal dimension of diplomacy and what exactly are the relationships between the leaders at that moment in the crisis, and can they change? They certainly did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I would encourage you to think about how you create the mechanisms of assurance there, and indeed trust, that might make that work. And then finally on AI, and I have a very interesting student assignment, which I'm actually grading at the moment, where I assign my students on my new nuclear crisis module to design a nuclear crisis scenario in which AI decision-making support systems were involved. And I think what's really interesting is that I think the general burden of discussion was a great piece by Andrew Reddy and Ankit Panda on War on the Rocks a couple of weeks ago about some of these points, which I would really encourage people to look at. I think there's a danger and a tendency to assume that these AI decision-making support systems are always going to lead to escalation. And I think there are two responses to that. First of all, as Evan Orr kind of alluded to, I think importantly, it's very important to remember that human decision makers ultimately are the ones who are deciding whether to accept or reject the AI recommendations. And we can imagine situations where the AI is recommending escalation, but human decision makers push against that. That's exactly what happened in 1983 when Stanislav Petrov didn't listen to what the machine was telling him, that the Soviet Union was under attack. He said, no, that doesn't add up. They're not just going to send 24 missiles at us. And so he made a human intervention that potentially avoided, a catastrophic situation. And I think we need to remember that with the AI. And the second possibility is, and this is one that we're very interested at BASIC in exploring further, is the idea you might be able to design and train AI in a way that actually gives recommendations that are de-escalatory, that actually helps you find off ramps. So I don't think we should foreclose on the possibility that AI decision-making support systems might actually have a positive role in crisis de-escalation. But I think that's a work in progress. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for those great remarks. Before I request my colleague, Ms. Aiza Azam, who is Director of Strategic Affairs and Outreach at the Strafasia, just one point. Nick, you referred to May 2025 crisis, and you alluded to the possibility of China's help to Pakistan, and also reference to Noor Khan-based strikes. So I think while we talk about perceptions of both India and Pakistan, another variable could be international perceptions of both India and Pakistan, because these things also affect the decision-making or the regional perceptions. Whatever the international media or international scholars think about the capabilities or the events outside, they also, in a way, indirectly affect the perceptions of both India and Pakistan about each other. So that's another dynamics. So, Ms. Aiza, if you can conclude and give a concluding remarks and thank the participants, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adil. So this was interesting as usual. I think all of our interactions with BASIC end up being this way. I'll just take a quick couple of minutes before I conclude. Based on the discussion that we've had today, And I think taking from the last point that Nick made in his remarks, this is something that we've also discussed in the last couple of interactions that we've had with BASIC, not just in Manama, but also before that when we hosted you in Air University. The concluding slide that you had, where you talked about the 4 factors, recognizing true vulnerability as a basis for shared security and maintaining confidence in each other's restraint. I think of those 4, these 2 in particular, but also the other 2. My mind, again, my initial response was that it really all just does come down to individual leadership and the trust that they have in each other. And this is a conversation which we've had recurrently in the last couple of years. So not just in terms of how they lead and how they perceive, how they act and how they respond during a crisis. But then the point remains that this is not something that would be sustainable, because once a leader changes, leaders don't inherit instincts. Leaders inherit, or successors rather don't inherit instincts, they inherit institutions. So in terms of boiling it down to the individual leadership, it's not really something that's sustainable. What would be sustainable is, does a leader have the ability to entrench willingness, the willingness to trust each other, to trust the adversary within the system after they have gone? I think it would require that you have leaders who can essentially convert personal trust or personal willingness to trust into structural interdependence. So entrenching the trust might not be possible, but entrenching cooperative habits, entrenching institutional routines, that is something that would be possible. Because I think that a leader who focuses on personalizing trust building might actually, or who focuses on personalizing the reduction of friction, might actually end up creating further instability if they do not end up institutionalizing it. I think in a nutshell, the argument is that if trust can be made structurally unnecessary, it can be replaced by architectures where cooperation is considered the rational choice. I think that's something that even I would be very interested in moving on further. And I do think that it also builds on the discussion that we finally had in Manama earlier this year, in which you also referred to when you talk about McNamara's remarks on not managing a crisis, but rather preventing one. I think that's something that can also lead into this as well. And with that, since we're also quite short on time, I just quickly move to, once again, thanking all the participants on behalf of the Strafasia team. But also especially thanks to BASIC for your thought-provoking work, for your very necessary work. And also I think the way that BASIC engages the South Asian strategic community, integrates everyone's perspectives, and creates space for us to give our input as well. I think that's something that is, it's brilliant work that's been done, and we're always very happy to work with BASIC on this. And a pleasure to see you all again. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Professor Wheeler or Eva or Mahari, if you want to say anything. Otherwise, it's a goodbye.
Well, just thank you again for having us. I'm really sorry that we're not there in person with you. I mean, that would have been so lovely. We hope very much that we'll come again soon and share, more with you. But also, a big thanks to everything you've done to support our work, over the years. I mean, you've been a really important partner from the get-go. And, it's been great to kind of come to Air, on a few occasions and talk to the students and engage with them and be part of this ongoing conversation over such a critically important issue, and to make very important kind of, friendships and relationships along the way. And so we look forward very much to continuing that journey with you. We've got some excellent news that we're going to be funded for a further 3 years. So we'll be continuing in this space. So that's really good news. We'll be doing more crisis simulations. And so, we look forward to, to working with you going forward. So on behalf of all of us, and indeed the wider responsibilities and global governance team, especially Dr. Chiara Cavasio, who's led us so brilliantly over these years and been so successful, thank you very much. And we look forward to being in touch and keeping the engagement going.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.